thank you guys all for joining. This is our first time using Hopin. It's been very exciting to kind of look around at it over the last couple of days. Just to get off with introducing ourselves, we're Dead Pet Girls. I'm Kat Dorman. I'm a writer and a curator based in DC.
And I'm Steph Bolton, and I'm a documentary assistant producer working in London.
And Dead Pet Girls is a platform that we run via our Instagram, Twitter, and website, which explores the world of pet loss. It all started one day on Instagram over DMs about Miley Cyrus's songs about her dead pets, specifically Mary Jane, and back in February, and thinking about how it mimicked the kind of sentimentality and kitschiness of Victorian pet poems and pet cemeteries, and it became a point of fascination for us. And after some research and planning, Dead Pet Girls was born. We think that grief is a really essential part of the human experience, but not much is said about pet death. But we hope to be a platform that helps to legitimize pet loss and add to the conversation of speaking more openly about loss, and to make it more regular in our society.
When we first started exploring the world of pet loss, we came across this term, disenfranchised grief. And it was coined in the 1980s by Kenneth Docker, a professor of gerontology. And he was teaching a lecture on the grief of widows with a grad student class. And one grad student made a comment, that's nothing like the grief of ex-spouses. And he asked her to elaborate. And she went on to explain that she had been married to someone for 25 years. The marriage fell apart. And then her ex-husband passed away. But she really felt that this grief was minimized and that there wasn't kind of a term that explained this gray area of grief. So Kenneth Docker started to consider this kind of the losses that are very much real losses for an individual, but that society doesn't necessarily consider to be a major legitimate loss. So Docker created this phrase, disenfranchised grief, the grief that cannot be publicly mourned, openly acknowledged, or receive social support. And pet loss fits exactly into this criteria, and is kind of part of one of the main reasons why we're doing what we're doing, to kind of put it into a box that becomes more legitimized.
So in spite of pet loss being a taboo, humans have for centuries found ways to memorialize their furry, feathered, and finned friends around the world. And so today we wanted to explore this by taking you on a virtual tour of some of the most amazing pet cemeteries around the globe and talk about the context surrounding them. So I will take us first to France, around the fin de siècle and the turn of the century from the 19th to the 20th. The Cemeteries des Chiens just outside of Paris is often referred to as the oldest pet cemetery in the world, but it's not. It does seem to be, there are many older ones around the world, but it does seem to be the oldest modern pet cemetery in which people could pay to bury their pets in Western Europe or the United States. It only predates a number of others by a few years, which we will be talking about parallels in England and then hopping over to the US in a bit. But the early decades of the 20th century saw a significant rise both in pet ownership and the proliferation of pet cemeteries. So I'm going to dig into Paris and treat it as kind of a case study of a number of pretty consistent factors at play surrounding the founding of public pet cemeteries in the early 20th century. And what I mean by public pet cemeteries is something that you could take your dog to, you would pay to bury it, it's publicly kept land, like a human cemetery. Generally, it's not buried in your yard or private property. And what I found really interesting since starting Dead Pet Girls and talking to people about pets more often is that we have this sense of pets as kind of a given, that people have always lived with animals as we do now. But that's actually not the case. For most of history, our relationships to animals were not this intimate, and they weren't really considered members of the family or treated as relatives and loved ones. And so I'm really interested in unpacking the ways in which we started to change our relationships to animals, particularly since the time frame in this case often aligns with the push for women's rights around the turn of the century. And so I'll also just preface this by saying that this focus is very upper middle class to aristocratic. Those are the best documented lives we have from that era. And those are the people with the most resources, both to bring pets into their homes and to memorialize them, which takes leisure time and funds. So back to Paris. In the final decades of the 19th century, if you could do the next slide, Steph.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Thank you. This will just be on in the background while I talk. So in the final decades of the 19th century, Paris was marked by a number of significant changes to the social fabric of the city. As with much of Western Europe and the United States, the late 19th century was marked by the twin forces of urbanization and industrialization, quickly transforming the city into a modern metropolis. The daily lives of Parisians changed as well. For working class residents, the nature of their labor changed and drew hundreds of thousands into the cities following jobs in the hope of better opportunity. Thanks to industrialization and increased productivity, the lives of more affluent Parisians were filled with more leisure time. And as the prices of goods decreased, a rise in consumerism as a factor of class identity occurred as well. And so in 1889, Paris had showed off at a lot of these innovations at the World's Fair, which today is often best known as the introduction of the Eiffel Tower to the city. So that's the environment that we are kind of thinking about. In spite of all of this industrialization and progress, there was also kind of a collective malaise that a lot of writers characterized in the period. And they often suggest that it's reflected by, quote, the reference to the lost war against Prussia, economic and demographic decline, the consumption of alcohol, the spread of atheism and crime, the general decline of family ties, the deterioration of morals. Though apparently by around 1906, this collective unease had largely subsided. And I think it's fair to say that this uneasiness likely stems from living in an era much like our own, with rapid social changes and redefined values. And so people were looking to define themselves and their families and their relationships in new and comforting ways. And we see people welcoming animals into their homes as part of that. In the second half of the 19th century, Paris's population swelled dramatically. Between 1851 and 1901, its population more than doubled, going from just over 1,227,000 residents in 1851 to over 2,700,000 in 1901. So that's massive change, which is important in terms of pet cemeteries because this really changed the city's infrastructure. In addition to adding housing and strengthening transportation, the city had to improve its sanitation. Next slide, please, Steph. In order to minimize the risk of disease spreading through the increasingly cramped city, which brings us to animal disposal. In Paris, as in London, it was fairly common practice to dispose of animals in general trash or in the river, which doesn't work when a city is being beautified, modernized, and so it just doesn't suit to have animals floating down the river or in the streets. And so they had to come up with new ways to dispose of them, which through a series of events led to the founding of pet cemeteries as people also became more attached to the animals and didn't want to just toss them in the river. And as urban lives grew increasingly removed from livestock and working animals, and as particular small breeds of dogs became status symbols and fashion accessories themselves, a trend which Steph will go into in more detail, animals now lived in homes alongside us and were companion rather than working animals, which is a monumental shift in the understanding of the relationship between humans and animals. In a couple minutes, I'll unpack it a little bit more, but there's a really interesting dynamic here of women defining themselves through the animals they kept. And as a quick sidebar, if anyone is interested in the rise of the animal rights movement in France around this time, I'm also happy to talk about that. It's really interesting. And so we see an increase in the earnest projection of human sensibilities onto pets, specifically dogs. As in France, in particular, dogs are seen to embody this kind of fidelity as the ultimate loyal, faithful, trusting companion. And we start seeing accounts of grief in animals where people project grief onto dogs whose owners have died or who've gone away on a long journey. Steph, if you could go to the next slide. They started looking backwards to ancient history, and from the Odyssey, one of the key examples that was held up at this time was Odysseus and Argus. Argus was Odysseus's dog, who here is very old and decrepit and waited for his master to finish the war and then make his really slow way home. And Odysseus, when he arrives back, is disguised. No one recognizes him, but his elderly dog does, and greets his master and is overjoyed. And they are reunited after over a decade apart. And then, fulfilled by seeing his master once more, Argus dies. And so that type of story is really held up around this era as showing how dogs are just old-fashioned, pure, and good, while the world is being seen again as kind of decaying and decadent and excessive. So that's just a really interesting kind of tidbit about how we mythologize the kind of good boy that we still have now, right? Good boy in terms of like dogs are good boys. And so that's something we still carry forward today. But around that same time, women in French society were navigating the public sphere in an increasingly public way and demanding equal rights in the feminist movement, which brings us to Marguerite Durand. In some accounts of her life, she's seen as a voice of the feminist movement, but in fact, her relationship to that movement was very tenuous. The feminists of the day fairly disliked her and her overt sexuality, leaning into aesthetics and opulence. And she also was anti-suffrage, so that's fair on their part. She was known for kind of leaning on her beauty to gain favor and money from men in order to live the life that she wanted. So I think it's fair to say that she was more interested in living the life that she wanted for herself rather than lifting her entire gender with her in that moment. But she did have a significant impact on the lives of women and ultimately leave what I would call a feminist legacy. But to look back at the New Woman more broadly, I think, Steph, if you could go to the next slide. In her book, Disruptive Acts, Mary Louise Roberts characterizes the rise of the New Woman through a 1901 article published in a Parisian newspaper, which is founded by Marguerite Durand, La Fronde, via this quote from the paper. Quote, "Of the many things disrupting contemporary society, perhaps the most important is the transformation of the lives of women. They, who have remained the same for centuries and centuries, across all civilizations, are now in the process of no longer being the same. While the traditional woman has not yet disappeared, she has been challenged by another, baptized new woman. The two are in conflict, and the world is fighting over them." So this sense of fighting and immediacy characterized how men viewed the daring new women who were living unconventional lives and doing work outside of the home that had been traditionally characterized as masculine in French culture. Women were navigating a web of expectations and identities, and the tangle of Durand's relationship to feminism is indicative of the web of social standards, identities, morals, and values with which people were trying to grapple during this era. And so on the slide in front of us, the two black and white images on the outside, oh, if you could go back, are both of Marguerite Durand at different stages of her life. And then in the middle is famous actress Sarah Bernhardt. And they are all kind of these big public new women who characterized that identity in France. And I will talk about it in a minute, but they were very strongly associated with the animals that they kept. And they tended towards big, wild animals, signifying that they were these wild, non-traditional, can't be tamed women. And so Marguerite's brand of feminism has been characterized as a spectacle. And to once again quote Mary Louise Roberts, her quote, "Feminism was about being seen, about visibility and visual beauty." And I think, just as a quick sidebar, what I think is really interesting is that this is the same discourse we see around feminism and aesthetics today, which is, and again, is also kind of aligned with the shift of animals at the time. And so I wanted to just unpack this image we have on the screen right now, which was published in a newspaper in the era, and that is Durand with a lion that she accepted from an overseas governor as a gift in 1910. And what's interesting about this piece, so here she is standing outside of the doors of her home, looking very empowered, holding the leash of this lion who was named Tiger, which again is kind of playful and playing with contradictions and dynamics and all of this. But then you also see the man behind the door who's actually like holding the rope and really still controlling scene reality, but he's behind the scenes. You don't see the focus is on her. She's empowered. She's proud and standing on her stoop in her dressing gown. It's a very provocative image for a woman of the era. Which makes sense for Durand, who was originally an actress, and she turned her attention to journalism. And in 1897, she founded La Fronde, which was staffed entirely by women, but it was not a feminist identifying publication. As previously mentioned, Durand did not fit easily in with the feminism of the era. She wanted her newspaper to cover, quote, normal stories like male-run papers did. She also had been married and was divorced after France had reintroduced divorce into this society in 1884. And so going back to the quote, we don't have to go back to the slide, but on a previous quote, or on one of the previous slides, I had a quote from Durand talking about that feminism will never know what it owes to my blonde hair, and feminism owes a great deal to my blonde hair, which seemed like frivolous, throwaway comments, but actually summarize the push and pull of aesthetics in the feminist movement of the time. Women were meant to be decorative and to serve as ornament for the men in their lives, which is a similar attitude to what we have towards animals in the period, which were seen as status symbols and complementary to the personalities or the status of their humans. They weren't seen as individuals in their own right. And so women like Durand and Sarah Bernhardt on the past page were very well known for keeping wild animals. Sarah was known to have kept a cheetah, a monkey, a wolf, and a boa constrictor. And again, we see people today purchasing these kind of exotic wild animals as a way to step outside of the bounds of normal polite society, or to show their excess of wealth or their resources that other people may not have. It's just a really interesting dynamic around exotic animals and the type of personality that someone likes to demonstrate. And so you might be thinking, why am I telling you all of this about the turn of the century French feminist movement when I'm supposed to be telling you about pet cemeteries? And it's because they have a lot of really similar forces. They push against conventions, especially religious and conservative values. And on a practical side, they're both born of the necessity of a changing landscape, both physical and social. And so if we can go to the next slide. This is a little video of the Paris Pet Cemetery, which I'll just let you guys watch for a minute. So the cemetery, it'll keep playing as I talk, but the cemetery was founded in 1899 by Marguerite Durand and lawyer Georges Harmont. And it was opened just outside of Paris, far enough away to meet the city's new requirements for the disposal of animals, which required it to be a certain number of meters away from water and the closest human dwelling. What's interesting about it is from the outside, it really resembles a human cemetery. You have this great Art Nouveau entry gate, and it's very grand, lots of beautiful memorials. Obviously, a lot of them have animals on them. But what's interesting about that is that there were a lot of restrictions placed in the cemetery about the types of monuments allowed, and graveside services of any kind were forbidden. I'm so sorry, give me 1 second. Too much talking early in the morning. So cemetery ceremonies and decorations that mimicked human burial were expressly prohibited, in a way that the line between human and canine was carefully drawn, suggesting that the animal graves are a, quote, de facto pastiche, an insistent confusion of canine and human. So I think like these to me are so grand and beautiful and expensive that you would think that they align with human styles, but they're, in the way that they are so opulent and so emotional and sentimental, I think that is actually kind of contrary to what one might think, what differentiates them from the human. They're so sentimental and they're so over the top. And so it's just kind of, as we get into more modern pet cemeteries, you see this really kitsch aesthetic. And I don't know exactly if you can quantify when that started, but it's just interesting to see the trajectory of that. And so in terms of burying your pet at the cemetery, for 5 francs in 1902, one could bury a pet in a common grave, but for 50 francs, one could keep a private plot for 10 years, and for 100, they would be guaranteed rest for 30 years. And so among the famous animals in the cemetery are Hollywood actor Rin Tin Tin, who we have a post on. And this monument right here is to bury the Saint Bernard, who we are going to talk about now, returning again to the theme of like mythologized heroic dogs. So that really beautiful stuffed dog is Barry. He died in the mid 1800s, so before the early to mid 1800s, long before the cemetery was founded. So the monument to him here is just a monument. He's not buried there. When he died, he was taken and stuffed. They actually had to restuff him because taxidermy has evolved over time. He did not look even this good originally. And so he is a really famous mountain rescue dog in Switzerland who saved 40 people over the course of his life on an alpine pass between Italy and Switzerland. There's a lot of really interesting mythology around his death. His gravestone there says he saved the lives of 40 people and died on the 41st, or saving the 41st. But then other accounts say that he was accidentally bayoneted by one of Napoleon's soldiers who thought he was a wolf. And so that was really tragic, and then also serves to kind of demonize Napoleon's army in the time after they've already fallen. So I think that's just a really interesting piece of mythology that kind of serves to use our affection for animals and animals who save human lives or better human lives to criticize those who have fallen out of favor, like Napoleon at this time. So in the middle, that's not a picture of Barry, but that is a picture of one of the St. Bernards from the monastery where he lived. That's his type of breed. Apparently that breed isn't really extant anymore. They've been bred out, but they were very strong, less fluffy than the ones we know today, great at carrying people around. And then books have been written about him, both in English and in other languages, movies about him. He's apparently so well known in Switzerland. He's this absolute icon. And so his massive statue greets you as you enter the pet cemetery, which just speaks again to this kind of valuing of dogs who embody certain attributes and valorizing animals as heroes. And so kind of to conclude this section, I think it's important to take away, oh yeah, here's another close-up of him. I forgot I put this in there. The reason I put a close-up in is because, oh, you can go back, because the face of the child, I don't know how you guys can see it, is so like cherubic and just like blissful. Like it looks like a little angel happy child face, which I don't think is unintentional. I think it suggests this dog is like just the like embodiment of comfort and goodness. So that was just, I'm obsessed with that monument. I highly recommend looking it up. But so, Mark, the reason that I spent so much time talking about the feminist movement in France and about Marguerite is that these are attributes we see in England, in the United States, and in other countries around this time of people who are founding pet cemeteries. It's oftentimes women on the fringes of upper class society who are largely independent, have their own means and wealth, but who don't fit tidily into either the progressive or the conventional woman of that era. There's also this personification of pets and attribution of particular traits to breeds, so positive traits for dogs, wildness, untamed, kind of scary, threatening moral standards for wild animals, and animals being seen as signifiers of their human companions. And then also this important of aesthetics, and specifically a differentiation from norms and from religious or religiously informed style conventions of that era, which we will continue to see throughout the rest of this presentation. So those are kind of themes to carry forward.
Nice one. So can everyone hear me? Can you hear me, Kat?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So now we go to England, my home. So the UK has a really long history of being a real pet-loving nation, and it's one of the first countries in the world to have started a welfare charity for animals, which was in 1824. And then, you know, I think going through to this year, the stats for 2021, there are now over 25 million cats and dogs in the UK, which is no doubt spurred on by the pandemic and everyone kind of reaching out for the comfort of a pet in the last year. But prior to the 19th century, animals in the home were more often than not sort of utilitarian working dogs. And as Kat mentioned earlier, you know, we think that we've always lived with pets and pets have always been in our homes, but that's really not been the case. In the 19th century is the sort of real heyday of pet keeping in the UK. But as Kat's also mentioned, it does remain for a very long time to be an elite and privileged thing. You know, you've got to think about putting food on the table for your own family without having to then worry about getting food for your dogs. So what we've got here is a little postcard, actually, I don't know why you'd want a postcard, of the dog cemetery at Hyde Park in London. So this is one of the first known pet cemeteries in the UK. It started in 1881 when the park keeper was asked to bury a dog called Cherry, which belonged to a Mr. and Mrs. Band, a very, you know, privileged couple that often walked Cherry around Hyde Park and had just become friendly with the park keeper, who was called Mr. Winbridge. So when Cherry passed away, they went round to see Mr. Winbridge and asked if he could be buried in the park lodge's garden. And so Cherry was the first dog buried there. And over time, it's sort of a snowball effect at Hyde Park. And more people hear that it's somewhere you can bury your dog, especially this privileged elite that kind of have the time to be wandering around Hyde Park. But with the sort of the cemetery really comes into sort of public knowledge in 1882, so a year later, when the Duke of Cambridge, Prince George's wife, wanted to bury her dog there, which was aptly named Prince. The dog had died in a really, really tragic way, and had been crushed under a carriage wheel going around the park, which actually was not an uncommon fate for dogs in this period. And Mr. Winbridge, the park keeper, was actually a former servant of the Duke of Cambridge, so permitted the burial in the garden. And once you've got a royal name on it, people come. So between 1881 and 1903, there were over 1,000 burials that took place in this very small space. And so I've got a video to show that shows you kind of, and I apologize ahead for the sort of quite creepy music that's put over it, but it just gives you a sense of how sort of close, I'll say that again, of how sort of closely buried these animals are. And it really kind of, it's, I mean, 1,000 burials in this small space, you can just see it for yourself. Yeah, and this image here just kind of, I mean, they are literally like littered around this Park Keepers Lodge. And they, you know, got to a point in sort of the early 20th century where it stopped, you know, Park Keepers stopped burying animals here, and it is actually closed off to the public presently. It opens kind of once a year for the Open Parks and Gardens weekend in London, which I'm going to try and go to next year to see it. But you can, I mean, if you go down to Hyde Park now, you can look, there are kind of, there's a fence that you can look through and look in. But yeah, it's a place that I'd love to go down and visit. And there's been some amazing studies this year that have come out kind of focusing in on this cemetery, which I'd recommend seeking because it's a fascinating cemetery. But the culture of memorializing and mourning pets in Victorian England has to sort of thank the culture of sentimentality that was present at the time. So sentimentality is a sort of movement that asserted that overshown feeling was not a weakness, but rather showed you to be a moral person. And Kat kind of alluded to this earlier, that there is this just kind of culture of being moral, and you get kind of a lot of families in this, you know, middle class privileged families in this era bringing pets into their home, not to, you know, be something fun for their children, or, you know, a friend for them, but actually to sort of teach them to care and sort of to kind of teach them in lieu of them actually teaching them. So this now brings us to Queen Victoria, who during this period was actually erecting her own pet cemetery on the Sandringham estate. So Queen Victoria is infamously a huge pet lover. And I think there's a lot of credit that goes to this time being height of the British Empire. There's dogs and animals of all sorts, exotic animals coming over to the UK. But Queen Victoria loved her dogs, and Border Collies, who were previously a working dog, are a breed that Queen Victoria was the one who popularized that breed to being more of a sort of domestic home dog. So these two statues that we've got here, Sharp and Noble, were erected at other estates. But when, it's going to go through. So she deeply adored her pets. But so her final collie dies, and she decides she wants to erect a royal pet cemetery in Sandringham. And I mean, speaking to her kind of era, it's incredible. I was looking through, when I was doing research for this, like looking through at the kind of side of mourning that comes through with the sentimental culture of kind of memento mori items. So this is actually something that was up for auction a couple of years ago, which is a framed photo of one of her dogs, Sharp, which actually has, it's going to come up, a little bit of the dog's hair in the back, which is really sweet and very classic of memento mori pieces of this time. But kind of shows, as we'll move on when we get to Queen Elizabeth, pets really kind of humanize these elite figures in this period, and continue to today, really. So yes, so Queen Victoria started the pet cemetery in 1887. But it was then revitalized by Queen Elizabeth in 1959 for her beloved corgis, an infatuation that has become quite uniquely part of her royal image. So she was gifted her first corgi by her father when she was really young, and she just stuck by that breed. And as we know, it is, I mean, Queen and corgi is an image that they're so intertwined. I've got, this is some of my favorites. I've got these are two photos from her 90th birthday celebration. So on the left, you've got the Queen with Charles. She doesn't look too pleased. And then on your right, you've got her Vanity Fair cover where she's with her dogs and she looks much more happier, much more full of life, which kind of goes alongside this narrative of Queen Elizabeth, that she is happier with her dogs than she is with her family. So yeah, so she revitalizes this cemetery. What's the next slide? Yeah, she revitalizes the cemetery, and she, I mean, interestingly, we found out recently that she takes a lot of time, personal time, to write the epitaphs and kind of figure out what she wants to say about these dogs. So there was a story from a couple of years ago where there was an auction happening of a note of a drawing of one of the graves of her dogs and the wording that she wanted to be used. And the royal estate had to get involved and shut down the auction because they didn't even know how it had got out of the palace. But it kind of let us in through the keyhole to kind of Queen Elizabeth sitting, writing kind of in a very sentimental way, epitaphs to her beloved dogs. So yeah, I kind of continue to understand how important the corgis are to her image. The Queen has had 30 corgis over the years. It's not known if they're all buried at Sandringham, but I think we can kind of assume that they are. But ultimately, the royal family kind of exist in this pseudo-immortal world, where they're aware that they will be going down in history. And although the Queen has her cemetery for her corgis, it's quite interesting, we think, that the biggest way that the pets are actually memorialized in the royal family is actually just through her image. And she's chosen from the very, very start of her reign to include the corgis as part of her image, which is why we have Queen and Corgi Christmas ornaments, Queen and Corgi slippers. Anyone seen The Crown, the corgis are part of the main cast. So although they are memorialized and buried in quite a personal way in the pet cemetery at Sandringham, the Queen has actually quite actively decided to immortalize them with herself by including them in her image. This painting we're looking at here is one that is an official portrait of her that hangs in the National Portrait Gallery. We've got, coins on her Jubilee coinage, corgis on her Jubilee coinage. Her statues around the world feature her dogs with her. So it's quite interesting how the pets of figures that, kind of not the average day person, but of quite high profile figures experience a different kind of memorialization that goes on outside of cemeteries, outside of kind of however you choose to memorialize them, but actually through to their image. And, long after these corgis cross the Rainbow Bridge, we will still remember them as we remember her.
And so now I'm going to take us to one of the most famous cemeteries in the United States, which is located in Calabasas, just a part of LA in California, which is better known as the home of the Kardashian family, to kind of set the scene. I think that's a good point of reference. So I'm going to start us off with a quick video. So this is just kind of the general vibe of the place. But if you can go to the next slide, I think it should be a video.
Harry can't be a happy place, but there is more love here than you will ever see in a human cemetery. My name is Ellen News, and this is my little dog named Chloe. I'm on the board of directors here in the Los Angeles Pet Cemetery in Calabasas. It is a nonprofit that is run by the public. It began in 1928. There is 60,000 pets buried here. We have pot-bellied pigs, lions, horses. We have dogs buried here that were involved in the 9/11 rescue. I have 4 pets buried here: Alfie, Cody, Suki, and Kiki. And there's space left for Chloe when her time comes. We treat every pet as if it were our own. The love of pets is a universal phenomenon. Everyone needs to have a way to grieve. We offer that to people here.
And so what I really like about that video, in addition to just giving kind of a survey of the cemetery, is her assertion that, quote, there is more love here than you'll ever see in a human cemetery. Because pet cemeteries don't fit in with the general culturally accepted modes of grief and loss, people who utilize pet cemeteries are able to display those emotions more directly than their human counterparts. And I also just want to point out the St. Francis statue at the front, which is a really interesting figure in a lot of pet cemeteries, just because thank you, Steph. Because the church, up until very recently, did not support burying animals. They thought it was kind of making light of human burial, and that they wouldn't acknowledge that animals had souls until very recently, and it's still a little contentious. But of course, St. Francis is known for being the saint of animals and his love and support of animals. And so there's a really interesting dynamic at play there. And so, as Steph just said in her section, we see the Queen's Corgi graveyard and her frequent depictions of corgis in those incredible corgi slippers, as a sign of something almost excessive. Her choice to bury them and pick their headstones herself speaks to her personal values. And the same can be said of normal, non-royal people who choose to bury their pets and memorialize them in public. And why is this seen as the case that it's something excessive and eccentric? 68% of American households have at least one pet. So it's not, most of us experience loss of a pet. And so I would argue that it's seen as something eccentric because of the way we, to kind of use TikTok terminology, gatekeep grief and mourning. As I mentioned in my previous section, and just now, there's been a long discomfort with animal memorials or graves resembling those of humans. It stems most directly back to religious ideals and the notion that honoring animal lives will cheapen the value of human ones. This also links back to the idea of disenfranchised grief, which Steph introduced us to early on, and finding ways to both transgress social boundaries and operate within them, as we saw in the turn of the century France. Many animal memorials take on a kitsch aesthetic, as though to say on their very surface that we know this is seen as silly and, quote, illegitimate. So we're cutting off the criticism by embracing it ourselves. And I would also argue that those clean corgi gifts are themselves very kitsch, which is excellent and interesting to think about because kitsch is usually seen as lowbrow. So perhaps by virtue of its location in LA, the Los Angeles Pet Memorial Park certainly embodies this kitsch aesthetic to a greater degree than many other pet cemeteries. It was founded in 1929 by Dr. Eugene Jones, and in the intervening 90 plus years has become the final resting place for many famous animals, including the MGM lions and 40,000 other animals, including the cheetah from the live action Tarzan films, Diana Ross's pets, Steven Spielberg's pets, Humphrey Bogart's pets, Mae West's pets. And I want to just take a slight deviation here and say that while Dr. Eugene Jones, a man, may have founded this pet cemetery, its care and upkeep today is in the hands of a woman who is pictured here. If you go, yeah. Who absolutely fits this mold that I talked about earlier. Her name is Shira Dance Falk, and she is in her early 70s. She was an actress and married to fellow actor and star of my grandmother's favorite show, Columbo, Peter Falk. And in her retirement, after she buried a number of pets there and joined the board, she was asked to take over managing the pet cemetery, and she said, sure. So again, it's a woman with kind of eccentric interests, a lot of means, and a passion for animals taking over. And then the gravestone on the side is Tori Spelling of 90210's dog grave. And I just thought it was a very kind of quintessential gravestone up there. And I love that it says, I love you, Tori, quote, mommy, or mommy. Like, I love that. And so if we could go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about defining kitsch. So it's generally defined as, quote, something that appeals to popular or lowbrow taste and is often of poor quality. The connotation here is negative. Kitsch is tacky. It's a cheap imitation of high quality original art or culture. This degradation implies both a lack in the object or the main mode of kitsch itself, but also in the person embracing kitsch. This person doesn't have good taste. And whether we know it or not, most of us have been taught that bad taste is actually a moral problem. Via the work of philosophers like Immanuel Kant, who argue that beauty is universal. And so if beauty is universal, then everyone should be able to recognize beauty. And if you can't, that's a moral deficiency and bad taste. And so if grieving your animal and being sentimental is kitsch and is in bad taste, then it's something immoral or unacceptable in the person who does it. And I think that's where we get a lot of this judgment, and that kind of continues to give people a sense of disenfranchised grief, because we have this moral judgment of those who embrace things that are at odds with culturally determined standards. And it's interesting because Steph's talked about sentimentality. Sentimentality is an excess in itself. It's an excess of emotion and feeling. And it went out of style really quickly and is actually more aligned with kitsch, if not aesthetically, in kind of attitude and way of being. And I think it's just interesting to point out that things that are excessive tend to go out of fashion very quickly, both in terms of style, but also how we conduct ourselves. And so if you think about how we refer to things as tacky or out of style, it's there's just something wrong about it. And so by and large, treating pets as humans or giving them respect of a burial and a burial site like a human is at odds with good taste. It's a cheap imitation of the love between a human parent and a child. Steph, if you could go ahead, we're gonna just show a couple of the other graves. It's kind of like a charade of the love between humans that's supposed to exist. And so we're given no time off. We're not expected to grieve. I'm so sorry. Should have had some tea before this. But here in LA, people are very consciously choosing to defy those standards. And I do think there's something, again, about it being located in LA that gives people that space where the culture is always changing and pushing boundaries. So here we just have a few of our favorite dog memorials. They're very brightly colored. These really don't resemble human graves, which is kind of an interesting point in itself. And what I love about Dodo's grave is those are little tennis balls in the bag, which is just so sweet and sad. And it shows, again, from the video, this notion that you can show your love so much more plainly here. You can feel that pain in a pet cemetery in a way that modern human cemeteries often don't allow. So yeah, that's kind of just the LA Pet Cemetery. There's another classic set of dog memorials there. Next slide. Japan. Steph, you're on mute. Sorry. And I just kicked her out. I'm sorry, I muted her. Sorry. And so I was trying to unmute her.
No, it happens. It happens. She'll make her way back, I'm sure. I'm positive.
Hearing the people.
There we go.
Sorry.
What just happened?
I kicked you out. I'm sorry. It was
Okay, let me share my screen again. One sec. Okay, are we good?
Yeah, yes, we're good.
You can hear me and see Japan?
Yes.
Okay, so welcome to Japan. So Japanese pet culture is one that has changed vastly over the centuries, and still, even in sort of the mid-19th century, a lot of cats and dogs in Japanese villages and cities actually lived communally, and there's kind of a long history of kind of street pets. So they weren't kind of living inside people's homes. And there's stories of kind of when pets would die, there's folk tradition that required special care to be taken of the deceased animal's remains in order to protect the local area from vengeful spirits. But today, Japan is one of the more forward-thinking countries we consider, as pets are considered part of the family in a very real way. There seems to be real movements, kind of obviously this kind of overarching principle that we've got of disenfranchised grief. Japan seems to be a country that's trying to kind of legitimize it more, perhaps more than others. There are huge Japanese firms that now have got written into bereavement leave for pet loss. And the first place I'd like to take us to isn't actually a cemetery, but a pet loss cafe in Tokyo. So one thing that's quite interesting about Japan is that there are sort of more than 20 million dogs and cats sort of raised a year, which actually is more than the total population of children under 15 years old. So there's obviously then, you know, for every pet that we bring into our lives, they leave us. So there is kind of growing sort of pet loss issue in Japan, because majority of homes have pets. And this pet loss cafe in Tokyo was set up by a company that creates these pet altars. So what you're looking at here is kind of a little memorial altar that you can have at home. So you've got the image of your pet, the cat here. I believe the little bone might be a candle, which is very sweet. Sometimes there'll be food offerings, or, you know, if it's a dog, their favorite tennis ball or toy or something like that. And it's something to have in the house to kind of remember your pet. And a company that was making these altars kind of realized that their workers were basically acting as kind of grief counselors when people came through, and that they didn't really have enough time to have the conversations that these customers were due. And so in one of their locations, they set up a pet loss cafe to basically people can come in, and as you can see on the left, there's a lot of pet loss literature that's available. There's a lot of Rainbow Bridge iconography in Japan, but it's a sort of peaceful place to go. You can see kind of in the bottom right corner these little post-it notes where you can write things, you know, messages to your pets or how you're feeling about things. And they actually have paid people working in the cafe who are there to listen to you and sort of hear the grief that you're going through to be shared. The next clip, which it is, yes. So the next clip I've got is someone who found the pet loss cafe quite useful to them in mourning their dog, and it's just an interview with them, kind of explaining their loss.
ずっと発信してるとやっぱりで良くないかなとかも思いながら、だから最初 2,3 ヶ月ぐらいの頃は。なんかお風呂の中とかトイレの中とかなんかそんなところでよく泣いてましたね。なんかもう1年以上経つのになんか全然ダメで。
You're muted again, sorry.
If you hover over yourself, there's 3 little dots.
Yeah.
There you go.
You're
back.
Yeah. Am I sharing screen? No.
Yeah, you are. It's
okay,
the columbarium.
Cool. So in the little video, you would have seen kind of she opens her phone up and she has a photo of the pet altar on the phone. One of the things she says in that interview, which I think's heartbreaking, but also so true, she said, you know, she found herself crying in the bathroom a lot. And this is the thing with disenfranchised grief, a grief that isn't legitimized by society. It's a grief that we have to kind of deal with privately, which is really, really heartbreaking. And you can see that this woman a year on has still not recovered from the loss of losing her dog. And in part, perhaps that's because she's not been given the social support, the platform to be able to speak to people. You know, she probably doesn't have family that she can share it with. So I really admire that Pet Loss Cafe and would love to see more of those around the world. And when we look at pet cemeteries in Japan, so Buddhism is a religion that's like largely shaped kind of pet loss and memorial culture in Japan. 46.5% of Japanese people are Buddhist, so that's 84 million people in Japan. And it has significantly shaped death rituals. The Buddhist scriptures don't speak of animals or pets. And that gap means that it's kind of left up to interpretation, which does create a little bit of debate. So one debate that exists in Japan around Pet loss is about reincarnation. There's kind of one set of Buddhists that believe that a pet can reincarnate into a human body. So some people kind of believe that they kind of meet their pets again as human friends, and others believe that, you know, humans are above pets and that a pet can only ever become a pet again. These days in Japan, pets are kind of so commonly associated as part of the family dynamic, hence the altar in the family home. You often see them kind of included in family portraits, and also, as I said, there are more pets than children under the age of 15. So it kind of, there's a kind of also a culture of people, there's people thinking that pets replace children in the lives of people that don't want to have children and whatever. But yeah, in Tokyo alone, there are 7 pet cemeteries, which is an enormous amount for a city. This one we're looking at here is a Buddhist pet cemetery. And as you can see, there are all these little kind of boxes where you place your pet's ashes, and you can leave flowers for your pet. You can leave a photo of your pet. Often people come and bring like little cans of dog food or cat food. I think, is it the next one? Oh, I will show you this little video here. Some more dramatic and ominous music. But I think because pet death is something that actually is quite respected, or is more respected than other cultures, it kind of lends to the kind of expansion of defining what actually is a pet. So a story that we recently featured over on our Instagram account was a story of robo-dog funerals in Japan. So the Aibo, if anyone remembers 90s babies. So in 1999, Sony brought out a robot dog for the first time, and they sold out in 20 minutes. People were desperate for kind of the new pet technology, and they were all the rage. I had a little one. I didn't have a proper, really expensive Aibo, but I had a version of it from Toys R Us, and loved it as a kid. However, by 2006, Sony suddenly halted the manufacturing of Aibos, and by 2014, they tragically announced that they would no longer be supporting updates to the robo-dogs, which essentially sent these Aibos into a mass euthanasia, because there are these people who have them and they could, you know, they could get extra parts, they could get system updates, and all of a sudden, once Sony shut down that part of its team, that the kind of Aibo community had to realize that these pets that were, I guess, immortal when you first got them, suddenly they had a kind of a shelf life like everything else. So online communities of Aibo owners were thrown into a total frenzy, suddenly having to accept that their robot dogs' lives would eventually come to an end. And online threads grew, filling with tips on how to ensure your Aibo lived on, like YouTube videos of how you could kind of hack it and try and keep these robot dogs alive. And what happened was a sort of tech expert ended up setting up what he didn't quite realize was going to end up being a sort of cyber hospital for these Aibos. He was fantastic at fixing them and repairing them, and he wanted people to donate those that they didn't want to use anymore as parts for ones that could be, so the parts could be reused in ones that we wanted to keep alive.
So sorry. The screen share is gray right now, and I know they're really great pictures. So I don't know if you want to.
Have you got that one?
No.
You've got nothing?
It's just gray. Like it looks like it almost hasn't loaded.
Okay, let me just go back. I'll just share it again. 1 second.
They're too good not to see.
Has that worked?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, cool. So did you see this one?
Yeah, that's the last one we saw.
And then you've got this one. So what ended up happening was Norimatsu, this robo-dog vet, decided that he wanted to take in some of the eyebows that people no longer needed and wanted as parts for ones that people wanted to keep alive. But people grew so attached to these robot dogs, and he felt it was wrong to kind of take them apart from these owners. So he spoke to a priest of a Buddhist temple in Chiba, who kind of decided that he would take on doing Aibo funeral ceremonies. So the robot dogs are placed on an altar and tags are attached to their bodies with the dog's name and the owner's name. And the ceremony is much like a human Buddhist funeral, with prayers and blessings read out to honor the place that these Aibos had in their owners' lives before they go on to kind of keep others alive. And there's been a bit of controversy kind of about whether this should be happening. You know, it's kind of extending the definition of what is alive and what can be considered a pet. But the priest at this temple does not see anything wrong with doing this, and believes that kind of all things have a bit of soul. And if we consider things pets and we develop a relationship like that, that they should be honored in some way at the end of their life. So I've got a little clip of a ceremony. Oh, I'm gonna go back here for a second. So yeah, I think I find this actually very, very fascinating, what's been going on with the Aibos. And I think, you know, for anyone who grew up with Tamagotchis and Neopets, and kind of the digi-pet world, you do grow attached to these pets that aren't, you know, fully as we, you know, previously acknowledged pets to be. But I was chatting to Kat before we went live with this about if anyone saw Mark Zuckerberg's very strange metaverse video, and if we are going to all be living in the metaverse, then what do pets look like in the metaverse? What does memorializing pets look like in the metaverse? So I think it's not something to dismiss. I think it's something to really kind of acknowledge and think about when we are considering pet bereavement, pet loss, pet memorialization. I think it's fascinating, and it brings us on to our conclusion. So we were kind of thinking of the common iterations of a pet cemetery today. Cremation is one of the popular forms of kind of having a pet end of life, kind of what to do with the pet at the end of the life. But this, you know, cremation is often that you have your urn and you have it at home and the pet is back in the home with you. There's less pet burial that goes on generally. So there's it's less public, I guess. We were thinking that, I mean, for us, like, we consider that Instagram and social media has actually become a kind of new pet cemetery. So from celebrities right down to everyday folk, when we lose a pet, one of the first things people do is turn to social media, whether they want to post a carousel of images of their pet together, you know, a long caption, which becomes kind of an epitaph in a way. And it kind of is the great equalizer between celebrities and the everyday person. Going back to what we said about the Queen and royalty and bourgeois Parisian folks kind of pets are something that makes people seem very normal, and seeing posts like this, you think, oh, I also, grief and death is the great equalizer, and having it all on social media for everyone is kind of this kind of thing that grounds us all. But kind of one thing I think to consider is that the internet is also still, it's not the real world, it's not public. Although the internet is good with pet death, and I don't think people feel like they can't post about pet death. The taboo is less on the internet. We both think that the taboo in real life is very much still there. I think people still struggle with getting time off for pet bereavement. I think there are definitely people that would feel perhaps embarrassed if they needed to cancel a social engagement because they were still upset by the loss of a pet. It's still not fully legitimized in our society, even though you scroll through Instagram and kind of do see, and especially if you follow us, you see it more regularly. But we still are at this point where it's still in that grey area of grief. And I think it's just interesting to kind of consider, looking back through where we've kind of taken you today, kind of noticing the ways in which pets are memorialized today. Just go out of here. Have I stopped sharing my screen?
No.
Okay, hang on.
There you go.
Ooh, there you go. So, our work is over on Dead Pet Girls. So we are on Instagram and Twitter, and we have a website. Our work is just to we're constantly talking about it. We post multiple times a week, looking at all different kinds of aspects of pet loss. And it's kind of a way of just normalizing it and talking about it more. And also, I was at some talks yesterday as part of this conference, which we're so excited to be part of, and just talking about it more, and death in general. I think, if talking about pet death makes people acknowledge their own mortality a bit more as well, it's kind of all part of where we consider ourselves to be kind of like a death positive duo who understand that death is a part of life, and that pet death is a component of that as well. So yeah,
and we'll be hanging out in our booth a little bit after this.
And tomorrow as well, you might.
Yeah. So if anyone has any thoughts or questions or wants to chat about anything, please drop us a line. Or if you have a story or a pet that you've grieved, we love those. We love talking about it. We love sharing those. We've shared a lot of different personal stories about pet loss and grief.
Feel free to email, DM on Twitter or Instagram. To share personal stories of pet loss is something we're really, really keen about doing. So yeah.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much.